Well, welcome everyone back to ILR for the winter semester and to the course USA at 250 Years, the Unfinished Revolution. Please turn off your cell phones or quiet them. And so let me introduce our course, and our speaker today will be Richard MacMaster, he'll be presenting by Zoom. He's a caretaker for his ailing wife, Eve. So I asked him to present from home rather than to schlep himself here today. Let me introduce the course. By the way, I'm Rick Gold. As we head towards the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, it's time to take a clear-eyed view of U.S. history and celebrate the country's accomplishments, errors, and continuing challenges. Many groups and governmental organizations will mark the U.S. semi-quincentennial by various events in Washington, D.C. and throughout the U.S. leading up to July 4th, 2026. Two main organizations are organizing celebrations at the federal level: the nonpartisan Congressional America 250 Commission, created in 2016, and the White House Salute to America 250 Task Force, chaired by President Trump and established in 2025. In addition, the America 250 Civics Education Coalition will develop civics education programming. The America First Policy Institute will lead the coalition of more than 40 conservative organizations with oversight from the Department of Education. While many Americans wish the celebrations to remain nonpartisan, the Trump administration has politicized historical interpretations, education, and event planning. For example, the administration requested an audit of federal historical sites and the Smithsonian Museum to remove diversity narratives viewed as promoting DEI and leftist ideologies. And as some of you might have heard, the packages from all of these institutions are due to the White House today. The Economist magazine described this as an example of the nation's history becoming a partisan battleground ahead of the festivities. The White House has imposed their perspective on the nonpartisan Congressional America 250 Commission. The commission allowed its American 250 branding to be used at rallies for Donald Trump. A letter by all of the Democratic lawmakers on the commission wrote that, unfortunately, recent America 250 funded and branded events have been partisan and have not served America 250's purpose and mission of uniting us as a nation. The White House Salute to America 250 Task Force has partnered with conservative Hillsdale College to provide a politically biased history series of videos. State capitals, schools, and embassies are featuring the task force Founders Museum exhibit made in partnership with politically conservative PragerU. Historians are attempting to fight increased partisanship in celebrating the semi-quincentennial. John Diggle, the president and chief executive of the American Association for State and Local History, told the 5,500 affiliate organizations, "Don't cede the narrative of the 250th to those who would subvert its educational and unifying potential. This course is one of several presented by ILR this year that reflect current historical understandings of the U.S. during the revolutionary period and their implications for today. Let me introduce Richard MacMaster. Richard MacMaster is a retired professor of U.S. history. Some say a long retired professor. He earned a doctorate at Georgetown University, writing a dissertation on the U.S., Great Britain, and the suppression of the slave trade to Cuba. He's focused on 18th century America, especially economic and religious trends and immigration. Professor MacMaster was affiliated with the Department of History at the University of Florida. He also coordinated Gainesville's Interfaith Alliance for Immigrant Justice and co-founded Welcoming Gainesville and Alachua County. Richard, you can go ahead.
Well, thank you. That was an excellent prologue for the whole course, Rick. I very much appreciate that. So, I'm getting a blank here. You can all hear me, I trust. So, I will trust that you can hear me. All right. The idea of this specific course on the U.S. at 250, the unfinished revolution, came from our mutual friend Jake Gordon, and he made some preliminary efforts at pulling it together, and then his circumstances changed, and somewhat late in the day, I was invited to come in and take over. So we're looking here at the idea of, and as Rick just reminded you, the very politically dynamic question of interpreting the American Revolution. If it is an unfinished revolution in some area, we have to know, was that really one of the goals of the American Revolution? And so we're going to be looking at various interpretations. While, for example, the Revolutionary War years saw American women, both patriots and loyalists, taking remarkable positions and taking leadership in some areas, for example, publishing newspapers. We could not say that full voting rights for women was ever a goal of the American Revolution, so it's no surprise that it took 150 years before women had the vote. And similarly, if we see free trade as objection to the British over-regulation of American commerce in the colonies, that may well have been an influential goal. At the same time, it's ironic that within 50 years, the British had moved to free trade and the Americans had hedged imports round with all kinds of tariffs and regulations, and continue that, as we know, right into the present time. So this is what we're going to be looking at. Very, very briefly, the agenda there, the beginnings, the causes, the excesses, and then the kind of central issue of British colonial policy and the French and Indian War, and then on to further interpretations, and maybe we can come to some conclusion. Of course, it would be absurd to think that any event has just one simple cause, whether it's something that happened in the last 6 months or something that happened 250 years ago. So it will be a combination of interpretations that we find most satisfactory, we hope. So let's go on to the next one. Next picture. Well, the next, yeah, okay. Now, one of the questions of interpretation is, when did it begin? There are some indications that the American Revolution, in a sense, began as soon as the first English settlers came to Jamestown. Or it could be 1689, the crucial year of the glorious revolution at home that brought William and Mary to the throne, and the parallel action when the New England and New York and New Jersey colonial leaders throughout the Dominion of New England established by James II and returned to their own independent colonial identities. 1754, the beginning of the French and Indian War, may well be crucial. 1763, when Britain is launching both a new colonial policy and possibly an attempt to raise revenue in the colonies. 1769, when the attempt to raise money became perhaps crucial, but had led to a strictly illegal combination of Americans to boycott all British goods. And that required some kind of enforcement. 1774, when the quasi-independent Continental Congress met for the first time, or 1775 at Lexington and Concord. So many choices, and many people looked at different dates along the line. Let's take the next one, which is dealing with the causes. Were the causes essentially constitutional? And we'll look at that in more detail, all of these in more detail in a moment. But a number of historians, and especially earlier historians, tended to focus primarily on the institutional issues, whether there would be more or less independence or autonomy for the colonies, or more or less control from Parliament. The obvious one on taxation, no taxation without representation, became the battle cry, or regulation, that in the 1760s, a new policy tended to bring closer British control over a number of things that had been just left to what they used to call salutary neglect. Or was it the pressure of various social changes in the colonies that were looking to push a revolution rather than simply a going along with the way things are now? And finally, this idea of an expansionist cause. Was it simply that America was beginning, the American colonies were beginning to feel their own power their own ability to spread over the continent, at least to the Mississippi River, and were looking to become a trading partner on equal grounds with Britain, and really calling for free trade. Let's see the next one. Well, I should begin to. All right, the next one really is, and this is echoing some of the things that Rick exposed at the very beginning. Was the revolution essentially dependent on the thought and writings and readings of a small elite of powerful, generally wealthy people? Was it dependent rather on the contribution of a great mass of ordinary people who were pressing for changes that would benefit their lives, and were not thinking in terms of philosophical or governmental change as such? It's an interesting idea because there's a back and forth between the founding fathers as the sole or major fount of American liberty and the idea of the almost the proletariat playing a significant role. So these are all things that we want to be looking at. Now, moving along, one of the next one, please. What, and this is a general caption there. Let's go to the next one. All right. The next one, please. Okay. Was separation inevitable? Was it really a need for autonomy from the very beginning? In 1774, Thomas Jefferson argued in his Rights of British America that from the very first arrival of the English settlers, they carried with them all of the rights and privileges and liberties of English subjects at home, and that their ties with the governing body in the Parliament in Westminster were insignificant. So he argued that with a parallel, interestingly, to the movement of the first Anglo-Saxons from their home in Germany and Friesland to England, that they did not continue with control from, as it were, the mother country, that they became autonomous and built what we know as England from the 5th century onward. And others had felt somewhat the same way. Charles MacLean Andrews, who was the major student of American colonial history, saw something parallel, that the very beginning of the colonies meant that it would come ultimately to a separation, at least an autonomy, but more likely a separation from England. And other contemporaries, William Manning, a British Foreign Office official during the years of the American Revolution, had his testimony published by my friend Jack Green a number of years ago. And he pointed to the fact that there were what we might call deeper roots of discontent. It wasn't all something that happened in the 18th century. It was that there were, for example, one of the things he pointed to is that the ability to vote in England was limited to people who owned land freehold. Now, in England, that meant a comparatively small number of people. So you had the situation where, for example, the great William Wilberforce was elected to Parliament by the fact that his father basically owned that seat, and that a handful of people who had the ability to vote cast their vote for him. It wasn't necessarily always a bad thing. But in America, the ability to acquire land, Manning thought, belonged to virtually every person. So you could have a very different situation where the bulk of English people, even very well-to-do farmers, were tenants and could not vote. The number of tenants in the American colonies were comparatively few. So almost everyone could vote in Massachusetts or in Virginia or South Carolina, whether they did or they didn't. So that kind of idea that, it was inevitable. Let's look at the next one now, which is looking at a traditional approach. One of the Navigation Acts, which began in 1660 and were aimed primarily at protecting the British colonies and their trade from being taken over by the Dutch. The Dutch in the late 17th century were a major international trading and seagoing nation. So this was self-defense from England. They required various specific products to be brought to an English port before they could be exported anywhere else. Now, they also provided various kinds of subsidies and benefits for the production of certain other commodities, and the whole list of them. So the question was, were they something that crushed the American economy, or were they in fact beneficial? The book by Lawrence Harper, which has that title, The English Navigation Acts, in 1939, explored all of those issues and came rather to the conclusion that they were, on the whole, fairly helpful and certainly not harmful to the colonies. The new economic historians who knew everything with numbers and lost me before they started, argued, perhaps persuasively, that they actually were a drag on the American economy because they reduced the potential income of the colonies and even of the individual colonist who might not be involved in trade. The notion being that if the profit, the ultimate profit of selling Virginia or Maryland tobacco in the Dutch market went to a merchant in London or Whitehaven or Bristol, then that profit, which could have belonged to colonists, was a drag on their income. That's anyway one way of looking at that. I think the general notion now is that the Navigation Acts were pretty neutral. But what we do see cropping up is a call for free trade. It's in the Declaration of Independence, for example, that the recognition that maybe we would be better off if we could just take our tobacco or our wheat or corn or whatever it was we were shipping directly to the French market or to the market in Amsterdam or Rotterdam or into the Baltic. We were allowed to trade with the Mediterranean, but not anywhere north of Cape Finisterre under the Navigation Acts. Well, let's run to the next one. And that's the role of the French and Indian War. Were the Americans hard pressed in 1754 because they were required by royal governors acting under instructions from home to provide both men and money, basically to pay the men and to supply them for the defense of the colonies. If the French and their Indian allies were attacking all along the continent, then it was not just the British Army that was needed, as when Braddock brought his forces over in 1755, it was the combination of all of the colonies working together. And consequently, when Britain went to war with France and Spain ultimately in 1756, the 7 Years' War, it was understood that the Americans would supply men and money. Now, an interesting idea raised by Mark Egnall, a noted contemporary economic historian in York University in Canada, that the response was understandably very strong from Western counties in all of the colonies. If you were an exposed part of Pennsylvania, west of the Susquehanna, if you were representing the Shenandoah Valley counties in Virginia, where you were exposed to Indian attacks, if not necessarily French military maneuvers, then you were very much in favor of raising men and money. Whereas in the coast, the trading cities, the long-established settlements, there was much more reluctance and much more bargaining and arguing about supplying anything for the war effort. So that leads some, and also there was in 1754, for the first time perhaps, the realization that individual colonies could not go it alone, that we needed something of a unified front, and consequently the Albany Congress gave the location and the opportunity for Benjamin Franklin to offer a plan of union of all the colonies in 1754. So this overhangs everything here. Now let's get the next one, which is a very important one. All right. Quite a number of years ago, I had a summer at Johns Hopkins working with Jack Green, who remained a friend thereafter. And Jack Green in 1963, published what had been his dissertation, The Quest for Power. And this is a very significant idea about the coming of the revolution, because the lower houses, the directly elected assembly, they have various names, House of Delegates and so on, they saw themselves in the same position as the English Parliament. And as the Parliament from 1689 had gradually taken over power, especially the power of the purse, of both taxation and appropriation of money, so the colonial legislatures gained that power. And they used that power to reduce the royal governor, especially in the crisis of the French and Indian War, to being a beggar, coming to the lower house and saying that, we need this money. What do we have to do to get you to vote it? And equally so, the salaries of the governor and of all of the royal officials were dependent on the lower house, as was the appointed upper house. They too were now in thrall to the lower house. So by the end of the French and Indian War in 1763, you had a situation where the elected people in the legislature now had more or less effective control over the colony. Let's go to the next one now. That's Jack Green's contribution. It's British policy responded. There we got a little ahead of it. That's all right. British policy responded to that. Initially, there was a question of raising revenue. We don't have to go through this whole story, but the idea that Parliament was unwilling to raise the rate of taxation on land, which was the primary source of revenue in both Britain and the American colonies, because, as we were reminded a couple of minutes ago, the ownership of land in England was limited to a minority of people who owned very, very large tracts of land, and some additional freeholders who may have had smaller farms or other property. So they didn't want to do that, so they were casting around, could they raise money in America? They came on the idea of the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act was opposed not only in America, but perhaps even more vehemently in England, and was consequently repealed in 1766, and a declaratory act that, well, we can do this again if necessary, passed by Parliament. And often that is seen as crucial to the coming of the revolution. It's quite significant for two very different reasons. That from 1765, 1766, when there was a real, the opposition to the Stamp Act created a nationwide depression in England, and consequently that was the reason why it was repealed. That gave the Americans the idea that the British people in general were 100% behind them, and they were completely mistaken in that. And much of the policy on this side of the Atlantic would reflect that we were playing to our friends in Britain. Well, we began to do things that alienated them completely. So that's one result of that area, and that is a significant part of the lead-up, obviously, and nobody's disputed that. The other part was regaining control. If the elected legislature in South Carolina or Maryland had effectively isolated the royal governor and limited his power or the power of appointed officials, perhaps people in Parliament argued it was time to regain control, and an entirely new British policy that brought all of these offices that were appointed from Westminster under the direct financial control of Parliament, making them independent of the legislatures, and they began to move other areas which had been totally neglected, such as customs enforcement, into having a paid force answerable only to Westminster. So those were, among many other things, part of that regaining control that was quite annoying. So let's go on to the next one. Now, totally different way of looking at things. All right, let's get to Franklin Jameson. J. Franklin Jameson published a quite slim book in 1926 that said, we've been talking about all of these issues that involved government, that involved people in the Parliament in England, people in the Board of Trade, and other regulatory bodies. We've been looking at what the the founding fathers were saying, what were Sam Adams doing with the Sons of Liberty? How was the Virginia legislature moved to say, give us liberty or give us death? All of that was quite interesting, but he looked at this as a social movement. It's a very interesting little book. It's not a very big book, and he paid himself to have a copy sent to every member of the American Historical Association. He was at that time the president, and it picked up a number of very important issues. I used this thing in my classes, even though it was quite old. All right. One of the things was the right to vote. What about the ability of the people on the ground to control their own situation? It doesn't, no taxation without representation and so on, revolve into that ordinary people wanted to be able to have a say in government. He also raised the whole issue of, which of course, before I leave right to vote, that when the state constitutions were being drawn up in 1776 and thereafter, they provided a very, very open, at least all free white males owning land, and in some cases, like Pennsylvania, even without any property qualification at all. But property was very easy to obtain in America, so it was pretty universal. That sounds like a very significant part of the revolutionary movement. Religious freedom, that it wasn't simply abolishing the established church where it was established as the Anglican or Episcopal Church in the various colonies from New York south. It was also a question of saying, as Mason had said in the Virginia Declaration of Rights, that there should be absolute freedom of and every religious movement was on an equal level. And in Pennsylvania, there were no restrictions whatsoever. Some of the states had restrictions that they had to be Christians or they had to be Protestants, but Pennsylvania certainly didn't have to be anything. You had absolute freedom. And then the fact that during the Revolution, the abolition of slavery, and this, of course, is echoing a parallel development in England and Britain generally toward the abolition of slavery. And that led to very imperfect laws that basically provided for a gradual abolition, so gradual that you might not notice it for the next 50 years, but it was ending slavery sometimes much more rapidly in the northern states particularly, but then that ground to a halt in 1785. So that's one of the unfinished issues. All right, let's take the next one now. That's a very important book. Now, then the question is, this has been raised by a lot of progressive era historians. Charles and Mary Beard, History of the United States, 1921. Charles and Mary Beard did an enormous number of books. They're a very prolific couple. And one of them, actually just by Charles, was the economic origins of the American Constitution. And that provoked a whole school of graduate students and ultimately professors who were looking at the restrictions that came on, even though we had apparently said we wanted everyone to have the right to an equal vote. So the quote there, home rule, but who shall rule at home, is from one of those students who wrote widely on politics in the basically in the period between the revolution and the adoption of the Constitution, and was very much in the Beard school that the Constitution was a reaction to the idea that everyone would have an equal vote, and restored political power to the kind of elite who had been actually in the legislatures in the colonial period. Now let's go on to the next one. All right, now, the new social history in the 1960s, in the post-war years, there is a emphasis by most historians on not just the constitutional, institutional developments in government, but especially in the focus on the founding fathers. There are a whole lot of important books come out that basically, Gordon Wood, a number of others, that basically deal with that approach to history and to the causes and consequences of the revolution. The new social history, as it was termed, came in the 1960s and flourished in the 1970s, and it pointed, among other things, it pointed to ethnic and religious divisions that are quite significant in the period of the revolution. So, for example, in Pennsylvania and Virginia and all the way south and by the revolution right into Georgia, on the western side, you had a very, very strong Presbyterian minority or majority in those areas. And these people, while there were some individual Presbyterians who were loyalists, these people overwhelmingly supported the American Revolution. In other parts of Pennsylvania and in the southern colonies also, you had very significant populations of Quakers and Mennonites and Brethren and Moravians, all of whom, for religious reasons, opposed the war and refused to support it. So some quite interesting work was done in the 70s that showed how, in Pennsylvania particularly, these ethnic and religious divisions were very, very significant. And as far as the ethnic divisions, there were very large areas in the American colonies where English was not spoken. And if it was spoken, it was always as a second oral language. It was not the normal speech of the people. And you had these divisions that slowed down things. And but the new social history was looking at a lot of the idea of revolution from the bottom up. And for example, the role of the Sons of Liberty, of Sam Adams and his crowd, was much more significant than perhaps we were allowing, especially in the post-Second World War. Yeah, they were off to the side. It was important what Franklin and Jefferson and John Adams were saying. So I remember I had attempted to put together a textbook that was using a lot of the new social history, and I wanted my mentor, Dr. Remedy, to speak to a publisher on my behalf. And he told me that he thought it was absurd to deal with unemployed sailors on the Philadelphia waterfront to the detriment of understanding the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and so on. So I had enough water thrown on my project that I decided, well, I would pursue that. But at any rate, that was the division in those days. And he was the famous biographer of Andrew Jackson and Martin Van Buren. All right, let's go to the next one, which is, this is the return now. And I don't have to say any more on this because Rick said it so well at the very beginning, better than I would have, that we are now back to the idea of a very narrow, elite, conservative-minded constitution writing group who fulfilled the promise of the American Revolution. All right, let's come to the next one, which is expansionism. This is an idea put forward just within the last couple of years by Mark Engdahl, who's a very distinguished economic historian. And it was that one of the crucial things in the revolution was the fact that the Americans, just ordinary Americans, as well as the elites, saw our possibility as an expansionist economic power, both with regard to spreading into Western lands, taking control of all the land, driving out the indigenous people, and also becoming a major trading force in the world. And that required free trade. And he points out, for example, that, the Treaty of Peace was barely signed when American ships were heading out to all kinds of ports in Europe that they had not been allowed to go to, and the famous voyage that went all the way to Canton in China to open the China trade. So he would argue also that there had been a kind of division among the founding fathers who had those who had leaned in 1754 toward supplying the men and the materials that were needed, and those who were drawing back and saying, well, you know, maybe we don't have to have that focus on the West. Maybe we don't need to, but let's get what we can from free trade. And so I find his idea quite persuasive, that we were now at that point. And all these other issues lead into it, but these are the ones perhaps that tie them all together, not denying any others, just pulling these together and saying, yes, this is what the revolution was all about. Now, the question then is, how many of these causes and hopes and dreams were actually thwarted in the subsequent years, partly by the Constitution, and how did they leave for us today not just a wonderful heritage to celebrate, but a set of problems. And we'll be looking at these individually in the next 5 weeks, if you can bear with me. So I will pause at that point. We'll have some Q&A. Is that okay? Oh, I went an hour.
Start sharing the... Okay, and I think that maybe there needs to be the volume unmuted. Okay, any questions or comments?
I went too long. I'm sorry. I wasn't keeping time.
Oh, your hand raised. Oh, no. Okay. Other comments? Anybody online? I think we have about 17 people or so. Sure, 1 second. Wait, no, by microphone, please.
Events, I'm sorry. All of these events that you talked about were all prior to the revolution. I mean, it was a little confusing. The free trade and all of that was prior to them sitting down and writing the Constitution and you understand what I'm saying?
I didn't quite get the question. Could you repeat the question, Rick?
All the events that you were talking about, which was the free trade and this slavery, was that all before the revolution?
Yes. Yeah, the whole point was that these were things that people were concerned about and that led to the revolution, and consequently would say, well, if that was the cause, maybe the outcome they wanted was whatever it was that they were concerned about. And that's where then the next
Was there slavery before the revolution? Was there slavery before the revolution? I thought that was after.
Oh, slavery. Oh, of course. Of course, slavery was massive.
It was. Okay, I didn't know that.
A number of colonies, the majority, especially South Carolina, the majority of people were in fact enslaved. And that would run into the Constitution then with the the 3/5 compromise, which actually came up in the Articles of Confederation in 1776. So,
Great. I have a question. Just you talked about the interpretations in 1920s and 60s, and more recently. How intense is the debate now among historians in interpreting the revolution?
oh, I think it's very significant, very, very, very significant, and as your comments reflected, it has been another aspect of the divisions in the country as a whole that we want to go back to a safe and sound reading of this. Mark Egnall, I just gave you an example. Mark, of course, this is going back in several years, quite a few years. Mark Egnall gives the example that his professor at University of Wisconsin-Madison allowed him to write a dissertation on the economic causes of the revolution. But then when he had it all finished, he rejected it and forbade him to write on the American Revolution, which propelled him into being a student and an expert and a classic writer on the American economy in the period of the British colonies. So, and that was because he did not want to think that the revolution was anything other than the way he had described it in his books, as completely a kind of a elite founding fathers project that brought liberty to everybody and so on. So he would have been his professor would have been very happy to be signed up for the Hillsdale College nonsense. So
we do have a question from someone who is on Zoom, and I don't know if, Henry, you can figure out how to give her access to speak. Okay, if not, I forgot who actually raised the question, but if you could write the question in the Q&A, then it will be easier for us to access that. Other comments or questions? Okay, we're moving towards accessing the person online who is raising a question.
see anything.
Sure. In the meantime,
So I have a question. You were talking about debates. So what are they debating about? That they didn't want the revolution, or they wanted it? Some people didn't want it, and some people.
Oh, that was a very important point that was raised in the New Social History in the 60s and 70s, and is today. And that is that John Adams, for example, who was not prejudiced in the opposite direction, obviously, argued that at least a third of the people in the American colonies were, in fact, loyal to Britain throughout. So you could not simply write them off. I know that sort of the school textbooks in my day suggested that the loyalists were aristocrats, a handful of aristocrats and government placement and so on. So, we could just write them off. They just went with the British Army when they withdrew. And so, whereas actually, like, bulk of the loyalists were quite ordinary people of all walks of life, and some were concentrated more in other areas. A lot of the fighting and it really was a civil war on the western parts of the southern colonies was really between Scotch-Irish Presbyterians and loyalists who came, whether they might have been English, they might have been German, they might have been Scotch, they might have been anything, but they were loyalists, and they so you can't just say, well, the American people of the whole world united. No, they weren't at all. So that's at any rate something worth thinking about.
Right, thank you. Michelle Price, can you?
Yes, it's kind of, my statement is more of a comment than a question, but I would like your response to it. I watched Ken Burns' documentary a while ago on Thomas Jefferson, which was terrific. And they spoke the words of the Declaration of Independence, which were very elegant and beautiful. And I see us now as a country moving away from that and
Absolutely, yeah.
trashing it, in essence. I know it's political, and I don't know if we need to discuss politics, but I'm very disturbed with what's going on.
I think we all are.
Yeah.
So it's a terrible mess, because in many ways, the kind of things that Jefferson chronicled were, is, so to speak, the crimes of George III, although it was his government, it wasn't he personally did any of it. We've reversed it and said, well, no, the king has absolute authority. He should be a Stuart monarch. He should be able to determine this, determine that, and Parliament should be reduced to, Parliament or the Congress, should be reduced to just being a collection of yes men who, whatever you want, sir. And that had been the 17th century Stuart ideal. William and Mary tossed that out, and Parliament went to liberty, and then the American colonies followed suit. And now it seems like, oh no, we made a terrible mistake. Won't you please come back as an absolute monarch? So, yeah, I mean, it's terrible. And everybody's agreed on it. Everybody here has agreed on it, I'm sure.
Okay, let's thank Richard for a fantastic presentation.
And next week, we're looking at how united was it? And
We look forward to that.
So thank you for putting up with me. I didn't mean to go a full hour, but I just got carried away.
I think the subject required it. So.
Thanks.
Okay, well, thanks, everybody.
Thank you.